Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Campus Compact National Webinar Series. I'm J.R. Jameson, the Executive Director of the Indiana Campus Compact and the host of today's session. Before we begin, as a step toward honoring the truth and achieving healing and reconciliation, Campus Compact seeks to acknowledge the traditional native lands on which we stand. Given that we are gathering for today's webinar from across the country and even some of you from around the world, we invite you to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Native people where you are joining us from in the chat. I am participating from Muncie, Indiana, which is located on the traditional homelands of the Lenape people of the Miami Nation. Many other tribes, such as Kickapoo, Shawnee, and the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi, also called this area home. The region has long been a center for indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. Today, the Miami Nation of Indiana still resides in this area, although unfortunately, despite multiple efforts throughout many years and generations, the US Congress does not recognize the nation as separate from the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. However, members of the tribe continue to live here, contribute to the life of Indiana, and celebrate their heritage and traditions right here where I sit, in the Miami Nation of Indiana. We also want to recognize and stand in solidarity with those individuals who are continuing to call for racial justice and equitable communities, and affirm that Black lives matter. We commit to move beyond words into programs and actions that fully embody a commitment to full participation and equity. Today's webinar, examining mutual benefit and reciprocity as core distinctions between community engagement and public service, implications for scholars, practitioners, and administrators, is brought to you by Dr. Emily Janke, Dr. Terry Shelton, Dr. Kristen Norris, and Kristen Medlin. Dr. Janke is the director of the Institute for Community and Economic Engagement at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Her scholar administrative work addresses multiple aspects of community engagement, focused on community-university partnerships and institutional culture change strategies. In particular, she focuses on tracking and measuring community engagement and public service within and across institutions of higher education, the recognition of community-engaged scholarship and reappointment, promotion, and tenure policies, the role of conflict management and transformation in community-university partnerships, institutional support for community engagement, innovations in scholarly communications, and reciprocity, collaborative communication, and restorative practices as aspects of high-quality, ethical community engagement. Along with Barbara Holland and Kristen Medlin, Emily is an author of Collaboratory, a publicly searchable online database licensed to Treetop Commons LLC that shares an institutional story about who, what, where, with, and whom, and to what ends community-university partners are working toward community-identified priorities for shared learning and mutual benefits. Dr. Shelton is the Vice Chancellor of Research and Engagement at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. In her role, she focuses on the advancement of research at the university and manages activities in the areas of research administration, research integrity, innovation and commercialization, and community and economic engagement. She also oversees interdisciplinary, campus-wide research. A quintessential feature of Shelton's work is the bridging of research, policy, and evidence-based practice to create partnerships that build the capacity of communities, families and youth, service providers, researchers, and policymakers. Dr. Norris is the Director of Assessment for the Office of Community Engagement at IUPUI. In her role, she works with stakeholders to track community-engaged activities, to conduct assessment, evaluation, and research that transforms higher education and demonstrates how IUPUI's community-engaged activities support the institutional mission. Kristen Medlin is the Director of Research for the Collaboratory. She oversees the Collaboratory's specific research efforts to support, promote, and enhance the field of study related to community engagement and socially effective impact across all sectors. Before I hand the session over to our presenters, I want to invite the audience to submit questions throughout the session using the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen. Please do not use the regular chat box for questions, as the chat box will not be monitored by the presenters or by me during the session. So please use the official Q&A chat box, and questions will be addressed at the end of the session. On behalf of Campus Compact, thank you again for registering for today's session, and I'll now turn it over to the presenters.
So I believe I get to start you off. I'm Emily, and it's great to see you. Since I can't actually see you, I'm going to be following the chat. And so I'm very grateful to everyone who's on this call today. Could you advance the slide, please? The goals for this session are to talk about some really exciting work that we've been doing individually and then collectively on this team. Terry's going to talk about strategic leadership and tracking full portraits of engagement. We're going to talk about why and how to differentiate between terms. And so the ones that we're really focused on today are about community engagement and public service, as well as these ideas of reciprocity and mutual benefit that are often conflated and we're pulling apart here. We will be introducing a new data set to track and explore concepts using Collaboratory, and we've got some freshly collected, curated data that we're excited to share today. And then we'll talk a little bit more about our excitement about what this means to have kind of like big or bigger data to be able to look not only within our institutions, but to look across institutions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Terry Shelton.
Thanks. And I just wanted to comment that I think I so enjoyed the chats. We aren't going to be looking at them after this, but at the beginning, I don't think I've ever been on a presentation where there was so much acknowledgement of the land and the communities in which we are situated, and appreciate very much that feeling which we bring into this work. Whether you are an administrator or a researcher or a nonprofit leader or in government or student, I want you to kind of hold in two heads both strategic leadership and what you do and what you need to do in your role, whatever that role is, but also keeping in mind that we know that in order to really advance, deepen, broaden, enhance the quality of community engagement, that it really has to be an institutional commitment that is there. And so as we go through the presentation, just keeping that in mind about what you can do where you find yourself planted, but also how can we think about this from an institutional point of view, and what might we need to support scholarly community engagement wherever you find yourself. The three areas that are just to give some framing. So not an exhaustive list, but launching systems. So when I think about the work that we do at UNC Greensboro and my role in trying to support this, I think about how we make some decisions on what moves forward. Where and around what issues do we have mass where we want to invest in. And if you're investing in one thing, sometimes that means that you may not be investing in something else. So how do you think about those things that you're going to launch and those things that you need to sustain? And one of the things that we talk about a lot is thinking about how you move from that individual way of and establishing high quality engagement to collective. We're looking at it in an institutional, from an institutional basis. So how do we, what are we communicating? How do we handle some of those transitions in leadership, both on campus, but also in the community, so that we sustain things? We've recently gone through some new hiring. We have some relatively new deans, folks that are in key positions, and new provosts this year. So this is uppermost on our mind, and how we help somebody understand the history of what's gone on in community engagement, where they fit in, also the tools and information to move that discussion forward. Certainly, and supporting scholarly community engagement, we often talk about being matchmakers, both on campus and off campus. So I'm always thinking about what do I need to do to help that community engaged scholar, whether it's a new student coming as an undergraduate or graduate, a new faculty member, get connected, or maybe a senior faculty member that's having to reestablish a very robust agenda. How do you get them in the same room, and sometimes it's now a virtual room, with the partners that they need to move forward. Not just doing it.
Can I interrupt? I think you're breaking up a little bit, and so I'm wondering if maybe you stay close to the computer. I'm not sure if it's for headphones.
Thanks for that. Sorry, didn't mean to. Is this better?
I think so. We'll listen.
Okay. Yeah. Raise your finger. Thank you. And so with that connecting and convening, it's not just new students or faculty or existing faculty and students and administrators, but it may also be new initiatives that you're looking at. So strategic planning, launching a capital campaign, looking at new challenges. So for all of us, we've been looking at what is the implication of COVID? What is the implication of our dealing with structural racism and how that impacts very acutely our work in community engagement? So we know that those supports need to be there as we are connecting and convening around what and also how we do it in a way that advances and moves these initiatives forward. And then finally, and this is really teeing up our conversation, is tracking and measuring. I mean, I don't think you can be in higher ed and not have to be tracking and measuring what we're doing. But I think that we know that what you measure matters. So just by attending to something, it raises it in the visibility. But how you measure it, we can get a better idea. You can use those tools and that benchmarking in a better way when it is when that process is aligned and we're thoughtful about what we're doing. We're all about looking at collective impact, but how do you move from collecting all things in their silos to a big tent? And one of the things we've talked about is whether you're looking at your institutional application for community engaged status, or maybe you're looking at APLU's IEP application, or any of the other kind of benchmarking in your role as you're communicating with whoever your important constituents are, that as you move to gather all of these things and look at that collective impact, that we don't conflate terms. And I think this is really getting at the heart of the application of the presentation today, that we don't want to make community engagement better or worse than public service, but understanding the differences helps us to be more strategic, more intentional about what we're doing and what kinds of things help to support the whole range of community engagement, and to help us to be better stewards of the resources that we have, including those human resources and students and faculty, and most importantly, our community partners, their time and investment with that. So I will turn it over to, I think, Emily.
Thanks, Terry. And I appreciate having Terry as a part of this project and on the call, and her leadership. For the last 13 years that I've been at UNCG, part of our work has been to help understand what's going on our campus, to be able to tell a story, also to not only to other people, but to ourselves, right? To start to claim this identity of who we are as an engaged campus. And so often that kind of work is really important as we help people on our campuses to see that this is the work of incoming faculty, but also current faculty, that there are many of us that we're not alone on our campus, and to be connected. And so I wanted to share just a few slides here. One is really about portrait of engagement. And so as I've been involved in so many different projects to help communicate our messages, the thing that's been most helpful is thinking about what is our portrait of engagement. And so there are a couple of questions that I ask sometimes to help us understand this. My good friend Jerry McGuire, who's at UNCG, put it this way: what would be lost if we were to remove UNCG from Greensboro? What would they say that they had lost? And so that is an important way of thinking about our engagement with communities. And I'll explain a little bit why this is really important in a moment. The other question was asked by UNC System President Erskine Bowles, which was, how do we make the citizens of North Carolina fall back in love with this state? And that was part of a strategic plan almost a decade ago that was looking and talking with people across the state about, what is it that you want to see from your state system of higher education? And so these are different questions we can ask. And what we realize is that as we're creating metrics, as we're trying to tell that story, in my heart, my mind, when I got started, it was all about community. I want to make sure that, okay. I wanted to make sure that we were really promoting reciprocal, mutually beneficial community engagement partnerships. And so in the beginning, I gave short shrift, admittedly, to other forms of public engagement and contribution of our institution, because I was so focused on creating legitimacy of community engaged scholarship and community engaged teaching and service that I really had in my own, like I said, heart, brain work, had wanted to create sort of this separation and say, I'm just going to focus on this one thing. But what we realized is if I ask these questions to myself and I'm honest with the contributions that UNCG provides to Greensboro, to North Carolina, to the world, then I really need to get broader in the ways that I'm speaking about my work. And so this happens on so many campuses when we talk about, hey, I want to talk to you about your community engagement or your volunteerism or your service learning, right? Your curricular-based learning, your community-based learning. We have all these terms that we're using. And so that's one of the problems I think that we have as a field. It comes from a good place in a sense of that each of our campuses has a context and culture in which words and terms are born and supported. And at the same time, when we're trying to do field-based work, trying to do research and advanced understanding, it's really hard if we're each calling things differently. And so there's this desire to be precise as we talk not only in our own institutions, helping people to understand what do we mean by community engagement here at UNCG, but also as we think about it across the country. I'm just keeping an eye on my time. So one of the key aspects for us has been to try to understand community engagement as distinct or different, the same or different as from public service or volunteerism. And in part, this is because we wanted to be able to very clearly ask the right kinds of questions. So if someone's doing public service, asking them who their partner is doesn't necessarily make sense because they say, I'm not necessarily partnering with this organization. I may be collecting coats for kids, but it's not really our partner. They're the place that we are providing our service to. And so when we were trying to ask people questions about what they were doing, but also legitimize community engaged scholarship, we were trying to get more and more specific. I don't want to spend too much time here because I want to get to the next slide. If I could, I'll try to do it. So as we were working on our campuses to be able to track and measure and talk about these different forms of engagement and know when we needed to ask different kinds of questions related to partners around outcomes, processes. We know that there's the two terms that we've been using and are used in this study that we're sharing with you is the idea of public service and community engagement as two aspects of work. And originally these were seen as sort of two separate constructs that were not as related. Now as our study is starting to see really interesting connections. So public service is typically that idea of providing service to or for. It's an expert model, it's a delivery model. It's fantastic. It has fantastic outcomes and contributions for our communities, so we value this work. Community engagement is also a way in which we're contributing, but it's through mutually beneficial exchange of knowledge and resources. It's about partnerships and reciprocity. And this is a term that has been codified really by Carnegie Foundation. And I'm grateful for that because I feel like we're starting to get a better sense of what these things are. And we see this in the civic engagement white paper and others that are trying to sort of parse out, what do we mean by community engagement? How is this different than public service? And so there's a lot of values and principles that are brought up in the literature. Next slide. So the idea of mutual benefit, so in the Carnegie definition, they talk about mutual benefit and then partnership in a context of reciprocity. And so those are two different distinct terms that so often when I am talking with people, and faculty and staff in particular who are community engaged or doing this work, they conflate them and they say the same, they use them in the same ways, but they mean the same thing. And that's fine in everyday life, but if we are really trying to understand this from a scholarly perspective, trying to understand what is the difference that community engagement makes that makes it different and distinct from public service, then we really have to look at this definition and how it's carefully crafted. So the idea of mutual benefit is this idea of focusing on outputs and outcomes. I know I have a mutual beneficial partnership if we both get the thing that we expected to get from it, or at least get something that we find satisfactory. So it's about our outcomes, what we aim to get from it at the onset. And then as we think about, as we progress through our partnership, what did we get? Next slide, too, please. The second part is this idea of reciprocity. And so this is really focused on process. So the first one is output, outcomes, this one's process. So this is the how. And this is the one that has a number of fantastic articles on reciprocity that I can recommend. Dostilio et al. 2012, I love how they really dig into a lot of this work on reciprocity. And then this work that I'm presenting here around the cone is something that's really helped me think about the process and the way in which community engagement is, there are times in a partnership in which you do things in different ways with your partner. So sometimes you may be asked to do something on behalf of your partner, like write a letter of support for a grant, right? Or you may come in and do some sort of talk for the Rotary Club, right? Like there might be something that you do for them or on behalf of them. But there are also times if we're really understand reciprocity in our partnership, then we're also doing things with them. We're thought partners, we're developing ideas, we're planning, we're assessing together with them. And so reciprocity is often like a gut check kind of for me that when I talk to folks to ask them about a partnership and is it reciprocal? Do you really feel like you're doing this with them? People have a sense generally of yes, I would say that this is a partnership that is reciprocal or no. And so we know in like I keep saying, in our guts and our bodies, that we know when we feel like something is being done to us or for us, and when we feel like we're genuinely involved and in a reciprocal relationship. And so this is part of the definition is a degree to a degree that the experience is felt to be equitable, by all to be equitable. So there's that affective aspect. I will move on to the next slide. I think that might be Kristen.
So funny, I can sit here. Need to unmute. Got it. So, I come into this work a little bit behind after they've done all, I would say that UNCG, along with Kristen Medlin and Barbara Holland, laid the theoretical groundwork and created Collaboratory, to which IEPY has just greatly benefited from. We talk about tracking and monitoring at our institution, and what is it that we need to know? Why do we need to know it? And to what ends? And what are we tracking? And we are constantly thinking about who are our stakeholders, what do they care about, what do they need to know, and what kind of information would they benefit from. And we also talk about this continuum. We see public service and community engagement perhaps living and existing within a continuum. But we need to know the level of activity, the type of activity, the nature of it. I oftentimes am noted for saying the fabulous 5 numbers. Fabulous 5 I use as a fairly derogatory term to the fabulous 5 things that I was responsible for tracking early on in my career, which was the number of service learning courses, the number of students enrolled in them, the number of faculty who taught them, the number of service hours that students completed as a part of them, and the number of community partners, with the assumption that that was what we needed to know to understand whether or not we were an engaged institution. And then when we have moments like a pandemic or racial injustice happening in our communities, and we really want to know who do we partner with around racist and systemic injustices, we are struggling with those fabulous 5 numbers to answer it. So it's sort of where I've come into our thinking of all of this. Go ahead. Here is the best way to sort of describe Collaboratory. For those of you who are unaware of what Collaboratory is, it's the best way I could illustrate that Collaboratory puts the activity as the unit of analysis. So historically, in my fabulous 5 numbers examples, the course number would have been the unit of analysis, and we could have identified what other forms of high impact practices were, what type of service, what were the learning outcomes. Perhaps we would have known the location or who our partners were, and then based on our partners, we could have identified what type of organization they were within the community, if did they partner with other faculty and staff. So what's really unique here is that when you create, when you put the unit of analysis, the key identifier as the name of the activity, it opens up your ability to understand and examine partnerships and engagement in a whole new way. And so this is my best way of describing, I think, of how Collaboratory collects it. Obviously, this isn't exact data points, but theoretically speaking. And then when we talk about the key characteristics of reciprocity, we are talking about then in that diagram I just gave you, the connections between when we say that this activity is connected to a partner, what role does that partner provide? What role does that partner play in that activity? And in many ways, we call it operationalizing it. So in Collaboratory, you could have one activity and one or more community partners. And for each community partner you've identified, you can indicate what roles those partners play in that activity. So for example, I have activities in our Collaboratory related to cultural literacy across the state of Indiana, and I have 100 schools that we are working with on that. And each of those 100 schools might play the exact same role, but I might have also had the State Department of Education involved as a partner on that, and they play a very different role. So it just depends on, so keep in mind, we're talking about a very large set of information about roles that partners play in this. I will keep going if that's okay, Kristen, on the limitations of this. So yes. So I wouldn't say Collaboratory, we just, as any study whatsoever, there's limitations to anything that we do, and it's important for us to be acknowledging and of the limitations of using Collaboratory as a data set from which we can explore. So keep in mind that most of this information is self-reported by faculty and staff. In particular, at IUPUI and the way we've implemented Collaboratory, we leverage a proxy feature, which means that I have work study students who hear about a story and do some research about what a faculty member has done. And we pre-populate everything into Collaboratory for them as to reduce burden on faculty, because we all know how much faculty have other things going on. So in that case, a student, through a conversation and their other research, is interpreting perhaps the roles. Now a faculty member can always edit those, but we also know faculty are busy and they're just happy to have named the partners. We are not asking in Collaboratory for the community partners to tell us what they perceive their roles to be. So again, sometimes twice removed, who's determining what roles the partners play. We do not, in this study, look at the role that faculty and staff play. So we aren't saying that the faculty and staff are facilitating knowledge about the community or any other roles that we might have. Just doesn't capture that information. And again, the administrators are dictating how the information gets into Collaboratory, what information is in Collaboratory, what is represented, what is not yet represented. And to date, most of those activities only include one point in time. So there's lots of institutions now using Collaboratory. Many of them are also now beginning to track how activities have changed over time and the evolution of relationships. I think this is very critical as we've hit COVID. IUPUI is now in a unique position to really say how has partnerships and community engagement changed as a result of a specific, since March 6th when our institution shut down, and since perhaps even August when we went virtual. So we can now update. So a lot of people think about historical Fabulous 5 data collection methods was on an annual cycle. Collaboratory being an ongoing tracking data system that we can then begin to look at how things change and evolve over time, as opposed to having to count the same things. I mean, most of my bean counting of the Fabulous 5, I was really talking about the same people over and over again. I just got really good at counting the beans, in my opinion. Not that I was really saying that IUPUI was just doing so much more work around community engagement. But I now feel like we're in a better position to better understand how that's changed. Thank you. So one of my next focus, then I kind of want to illustrate for you guys a bit of our process in how we went about this study and what we're asking you to react to and think about and hopefully join us in a dialogue about. So we tried to go about a process of understanding and how we might rate reciprocity on a scale of low to high, or another way of thinking about that based on the cone that Emily just mentioned is on a thin or thick. So again, one of the things that we just thought about was that it was not about the absence or presence of that role, but instead, if that role exists, how reciprocal do we see it? I'll go to the next slide just so you can illustrate. So what we literally did individually, the columns that you see here on the right-hand side, those are the exact options that when you add a community partner into Collaboratory, you are able to say this partner played this role. We individually, one by one, went through and tried to rate or rank on a scale of 1 to 5 what level of reciprocity is if the community partner is providing information and materials, supervising students, is a co-investigator. Is that a thick or a thin, conversely high or a low? We got together after each of us had done this activity, and we looked at rankings in which there was 1 point or more apart, and we revised our responses, and then we came up with the averages of the scores. So I'll go to the next slide here. Actually, let me stay there. Kristen, will you do me a favor? Sorry, and go back one more exam. One thing I want to say here is what you see on the right-hand side. So these are the results of our exercises that we went through. And what you see in the table is that all those 20 roles that partners play are prompted of the owner's activity of what the people said in Collaboratory. You'll see in the middle column, the average score that we all ended up ranking. It's not surprising perhaps that some of those came out, as you see, fairly equally around the low, medium, and high levels. I think that's all I will say that when we did this activity, we thought it was a really interesting activity. And since then, all of us went separately to conferences. And so I'll go to the next slide. And we presented this exact same activity to participants in a variety of sessions. Specifically, we attended the Assessment Institute, IR Slice, and Kumu. But each of us in our own context offered our participants our ability to react to and express what they thought about this activity. And it was interesting. We struggled to assign some ratings at times, and we could all come up with certain examples where, well, I would give this a 5 if it was this activity, but I would give it a 2 if it was this. And we really were, it was a fascinating conversation. I can give you a couple of examples. So one of the ones that we talked about in one of my conferences was internships. internships oftentimes became when you rate the role of supervising the activity. We know most institutions of higher education aren't, the faculty and staff are not supervising students in an internship-based experience. And we put that, I would call, burden on the community partner. But there were examples in the audience where these internships were actually created intentionally in partnership with the faculty staff member in ways that were mutually beneficial. And so there were people who had said, well, at my institution in the internship or this program that I run where we have 5 internships with this community partner, we would say that's a very reciprocal high level activity. Another example that we talked about sometimes were summer camps. As you know, at IUPUI during the summer, we have a Girls STEM Institute to foster diverse students into STEM careers, and we host them on campus, which historically my work, as Emily mentioned, that was a public service activity. We didn't see it as much of a partnership. But as I started to look at the ways in which the roles would play in all of those, it became pretty impressive how many roles the partners, they would help market this, identify the target population, help recruit students, they would be involved in the process. So they served as mentors. And so depending on the summer camp, there were instances where I could see that being a very highly reciprocal role that the partners were playing. Another common question that came up is in community-based participatory action research when you're providing access to target populations. That's a pretty common thing that they play, but some of us have seen research where the role of the partner is to market the opportunity and provide participants to play in a study, and we see that as very transactional and not reciprocal, and so there's challenges to that. These are just examples that I illustrate for you that it came up in conversations at conferences that we presented these findings. It came up in our meetings, and we sort of have some really interesting thoughts as we reflected on those. Is that the process of trying to rank and operationalize reciprocity is a valuable thought-provoking exercise, and Collaboratory in that role can be a very strong faculty development tool in and of itself. And so depending on how you've implemented it, I have a great colleague, Ellen at IU Northwest, who really has taken this as a faculty development approach of thinking about it. We really thought about the extent to which reciprocity and mutual benefit are mutually exclusive. We can talk about that in a little bit as well. We had to acknowledge that we were only talking about the roles of partners and not necessarily the roles at faculty. And again, I mentioned an example where we would have thought something that was low reciprocity was actually probably the best, most feasible approach to the partnership, and maybe that was okay. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we found that these just led us to more questions. We also asked our participants what else was missing, and I would just say things like trust, and to what extent is there trust between the partners, power, and sort of outlining the decision-making process came up as things that people were interested in knowing, but it was hard to decipher in what they saw in the ratings and the roles that currently exist in Collaboratory. I think I'm good. And Kristen, I think I'm handing it over to you to tell everybody what we found.
Perfect. All right. So I'm going to pull up the reciprocity, or the cone of engagement that Emily shared earlier, and we're going to conveniently rename it the reciprocity cone here. And so what we did with our data, this is really one of our first forays into playing with Collaboratory data, which, as mentioned earlier, is collected mostly for administrative purposes. So for those pragmatic, practitioner-based needs that happen on a campus. And so there are naturally a lot of limitations that come with that data, but at the same time, there are some insights that come from a much larger data set than we've ever had access to, and in ways that are much easier to collect than we're used to. So remember, this exercise is not some incredibly long research project where it took us a very long time to collect the data, but actually once Collaboratory was up and running on our campuses, we have access to this data at a click or a couple of clicks. And so if we were to think about activities or roles in a given relationship taking place at various points on the cone, so with some of those items being more highly reciprocal, some of those things being more minimally reciprocal. Relationships ebb and flow. They're not always reciprocal 100% of the time. And so we started to think about what we could do to really try to aggregate up and almost come up with some sort of average, to understand at a high level the roles, what is the meaning of all of these roles that partners play in all of these various activities that make up a relationship between a community organization and the university. And so our question is, if we had, and remember going back to the table that we shared a little while ago, there were 3 levels of reciprocity. And so what if an activity had multiple roles that were highly reciprocal? We know in our work as administrators that many of the activities have some things that are going to be lower and some things that are going to be higher. And that's really dependent on who it is that's entering the data and how those administrators are choosing to roll it out. So like at IUPUI, tackling a number of internships and practicum-based things. At UNCG, looking for really strong spotlights of really great partnership work that was happening. So it really just depends on the campus. And what our research team did was set a bar that said for an activity to be reciprocal, as it's defined by Carnegie, if we were trying to unpack that word when we hear it used in practice, then we're suggesting that an activity has to have at least one highly reciprocal role. So really, out of the 20 options that you could select in Collaboratory, there's really about 7 of them that would register on the scale in this context. And so if we come forward here, I can talk a little bit about how we did this. And what you're looking at is the question in Collaboratory that this data is tracked through. So the question is, what is the organization's role in planning, implementing, or evaluating this activity? And so there are 20 options. You saw those in the table earlier. And if your activity had 5 partners, you were asked this question for every partner that you added in. So you can see it's highly relational here. So if one activity might have 3 community partners identified, and each of those partners may have multiple roles identified in the context of that activity. So this one activity is yielding 6 separate role data points. Which is really exciting and generative. And so while we could look at this data for all almost 40 campuses that are in our network now, we're choosing only to look at UNCG and IUPUI because Emily and Kristen Norris can provide the gut check around the validity of the data that faculty and staff are entering. So going back to some of Kristen's comments about proxies entering data and understanding the gist of what is in here. And so one of our goals with this, in Collaboratory, every activity that a faculty or staff member enters gets categorized as engagement or service. And so one of the things I'm really interested in is, like, are we doing a good job of categorizing those things? Are faculty and staff self-reporting appropriately? And what is the guidance that they're getting to determine if that's, you know, if they're fitting into that mold or not? And Emily and I can say that from previous experiences at UNCG, when we asked faculty to do this, it was typically flip-flopped. When we said, you know, read this set of criteria and determine where you fit, it was almost always the opposite of what we would have expected, because it was being influenced by disciplinary lenses or values or backgrounds in some way. And so here is the data set that we worked with. And I'm really excited about this because prior to Collaboratory, I feel like we only could look at a couple of unique case studies at a time. And so this gets a little bit to the promise of bigger data that Emily was talking about earlier. Ultimately, we had almost 10,000 data points on the roles that partners played in these activities. And so after cleaning all of this data where there wasn't a role, or maybe it was a public service activity that didn't identify a partner, we had almost 1,300 activities to pull from. You can see the proportion of those that are from both IUPUI and UNCG. And you'll see I've done a breakdown just to give you a sense of the different connection points. So we do provide the ability to categorize activities as either engagement or service, and there's a number of questions that do that. And then we ask users to also indicate where those activities are connected to teaching and research or scholarship. So you'll see the breakdown, CE and PS, community engagement and public service, as well as teaching and scholarship, the T and the S. The last thing I'll share about our data set it's almost 1,500 community partners that this data is being reported for. So if you go back to the chart on the previous slide that talks about the relationality of all of this data, we have community partners that are interacting on different activities, that may be playing different roles in different activities. And so the inquiry that we're doing here is really just the tip of the iceberg as to all of the things you could look at with this data. So moving along fairly quickly here, sharing just a couple of descriptives with you, because I think understanding counts can be really beneficial in certain contexts. And we can see here that the majority of activities that faculty and staff reported cited that community partners most often discuss how to work together. I think that this probably resonates with a number of folks who are trying to negotiate new relationships with community partners and understand what works and what doesn't, and how to collaborate together. And you can see the list kind of continues to go down from there. But I will say some of the things you're seeing up at the top around evaluating and providing feedback on the students' work and supervising students, these numbers are higher. I reran this analysis last week in comparison to the original analysis we did last fall, so fall of 2019. And our data set has increased by 250% for these two institutions. And I think that the higher numbers you're seeing in some of these roles that are considered more moderately or highly reciprocal on our scale is attributed to IUPUI's implementation strategies. So I do think we have to take our data with a grain of salt, but understanding and being able to interpret that can be really beneficial. Just a couple of other descriptives here. So we also looked at the data as broken down by engagement and service. I think a number of the distinctions here are due to the number of community engaged activities that we had. But here, the thing I wanted to call out is I would have expected to see an inverse relationship in terms of the proportions of each bar. So we had thought that maybe we would see the thicker roles happening more frequently in community engagement activities, and some of those activities, those thinner roles that had minimal levels of reciprocity might be more present in public service activities. And that did not turn out to be the case. As you can see from this image, you know, the numbers do decrease as we go down, and these are not in the order of like highly reciprocal down to minimally reciprocal. We'll look at that in a minute, but they're kind of all over the place. And so what other variables could we look at from Collaboratory that help us understand where, explain some of the distinctions that we're seeing here? And then again, looking at teaching and research. So these three bars up here being so significantly different, again, because of IUPUI's approach into some of those course-based activities. And so a heavy focus on providing feedback on students' work, discussing how to work together, and supervising and co-educating students. As you continue to go down here, this is a number that has changed significantly for us since I reran this data set. Last fall, we were able to call out the negotiation of costs and logistics as actually being higher in, or more frequently cited in public service activities. And that seemed confirmatory for us in the sense that partners are often negotiating event spaces or trying to understand, you know, contracts and MOUs when it comes to some of the more public service event type things that we do. But since our data set has increased significantly, that has shifted. And so now that number is being cited more by community engaged activities. So just curious to know what might be there. And I'm going to zoom through here. So this is the culmination of our thinking. And we said, let's go back and let's highlight the order of the counts of these roles based on where they fit within the reciprocity cone. And the thing that's really interesting here is that as our role data has grown, now we're at almost 10,000 data points. It's really distributed itself pretty evenly across these 3 levels. And so the least number of interactions are happening at the minimally reciprocal level, which was surprising to me, whereas the most are over here in the moderate and then high reciprocity roles being cited the second most frequently. So the work that faculty and staff are doing, or at least the work that's being reported through Collaboratory at these 2 universities, tends to be involving some of these thicker roles that community partners are playing. So if our goal was to create a model that suggests that community-university relationships are made up of all of these multiple interactions, ranging from transactional up to more transformational, we're suggesting that activities have a specific level of reciprocity that could be measured. And so we wanted to determine this level, and we created an idea, a thought experiment here that suggests that if an activity was to be classified as community engaged, that it needed to have at least one of the highly reciprocal roles that were identified as having high reciprocity. And so we were able to take this data from our data warehouse and run some scripts on it and come up with what you see on your screen now. And so if we unpack the work that's actually happening, and we say that an activity must display at least one highly reciprocal role, here's how that shakes out. So at IUPUI, 618 of their activities displayed at least one highly reciprocal role. So we're putting it in the minimally reciprocal category. And then 154 of their activities displayed 2 of these roles, so moderately reciprocal, and 62 displayed 3 of these highly reciprocal roles. And as a reminder, what you see in the top corner are what those highly reciprocal roles were identified as through our research team's exercise. And so the numbers from UNCG are not too far off in terms of the proportions, at least. They had a smaller sample size, but in general, you saw 12 activities with 1 highly reciprocal role, 18 with 2 reciprocal roles, and 62 with 3 reciprocal roles. So if you break this down to the percentage of their overall activity count in Collaboratory, we're able to see that out of the 1,287 activities that were reported at IUPUI, 79.6 of them are including at least 1 highly reciprocal role. And that at UNCG, 65.2% of them have at least 1 of these highly reciprocal roles. So the implications of this for me is that rather than having faculty and staff self-identify their work as engagement or service, which can often serve as a red herring, can often confuse and really turn people off to the work, we can more implicitly start to work to categorize them. And so here we can lean on the definition from Carnegie and say, in the context of partnership and reciprocity, and here's what we mean by that. And here's the number of things that are happening on our campus that meet that standard. So next steps, and I think I'll keep talking here. I know we're almost to time, but we're continuing to think about this. We're working with the American Association of State Colleges and Universities to think about how our engagement is changing and what we can learn from the data as institutions really grapple with not only what their institution is facing, but the new things that are facing their communities as well. And the thing that I want to make sure we really call forward is that data and projects like this, we're really committed to making a possibility for researchers in the field. So this is something that we've been talking about for a long time. And I think we're at the point where we are ready to start talking with researchers who are interested in using collaboratory data for research purposes. So if there are folks out there who are interested in our codebook who can go to Collaboratory's website or any of the public portals, you can get a sense of the data that we collect. And we're working on a process to, and we're working in partnership with UNCG to put together a research review board and really do some consultative work with the applicant and just try to understand the questions they're trying to get answered, understand if collaboratory data could be a good fit for those. And find the best way to get them that data and help them do their work. So please feel free to reach out if that sounds like it's of interest. And I'll invite, I know JR, I feel like there's Q&A that needs to happen. I also want to invite my co-presenters if there's any final thoughts they have, and I'll be quiet.
I wanted to highlight what Kristen has listed here as a research fellows, and I just want to appreciate what Collaboratory has been a great partner to our institution. And I see them, their approach to not being a tech tool, but really a partner in how do we explore this. So Kristen's got a couple, like 3 different research fellows. You could probably throw something in the chat about what they're doing, but they've got one exploring what does anti-racist community engagement look like, and some others that I think are really really awesome. And I find this is always fun when you do this stuff for us, because Kristen updated these slides, and so much of what's in our Collaboratory since our first presentation, we've gotten a large data set of really truly clinical placements within the social work field, and those are not to be dismissed as important placements and services that the social work students provide, but you can definitely see it come out in this. So like they're co-educating these students. And it just makes me wonder, is it really community engagement? And because then if you think about the Carnegie definition, we're pretty dismissive of teacher placements, clinical placements, and internships and their role. And just, I mean, if we think of it this way, I just don't know that that's, if you were to remove the university from the city, how does that then affect it, right? And so I think it's an important, yeah, I don't know if it makes anybody else think that way, but I start to question and think about our role and capacity.
I would just remind participants, if you do have a question, to go ahead and drop that in the Q&A chat box. There have been a few questions along the way that the panelists were able to answer in real time, but if there are other questions, please feel free to drop those now. I do have a question for the panelists that I'm a little curious about. So when you think about the high, medium, low reciprocity numbers, were you at IUPUI and University of North Carolina, Greensboro, were you happy with those numbers? How did it change perhaps training that you provide to faculty? If you choose to increase those numbers, or you think they need to be higher on the reciprocity? I'm just curious, where do you fall on your happiness level of where those numbers are, and if they should be higher or if they're at a good place?
I can speak just from my perspective. I think early on in statistics classes, you learn that like if you're really surprised by the data, you should probably like double check your work because there are very few big surprises that it's often an error or not. I think it could be an error of thinking or an error of technique. And so for me, I'm still feeling very open to this idea of questioning our assumptions about what like these values that we're placing on particular types of roles and saying, oh, this is like Kristen was talking about, internships and the services, especially in social work, and the values that social work carries into their internships, the level of engagement, the public purpose of that work. And so trying to understand and sort of problematize our own thinking about value, while at the same time getting clearer about what community engagement does that's different. And so I think for me as a researcher, but also as a administrator, it's helped me just to be more open and to engage people about why they're doing this work and how they're connected to it. Though we have talked about, could this tool, as we continue to refine our understanding, be used to start to find people who are doing highly reciprocal work and invite them perhaps to be the partnerships that we showcase for Collaboratory or the IEP or whatever it might be that's looking for collaborative partnerships. And then also thinking about professional development. Are there some people we need to chat with that maybe could be integrating this in a different kind of way? So there are ways to start to parse it.
All the things that Emily said just made me question everything I've been thinking about in my life. And then I guess what's the capacity of the community? So when I originally read that and I originally see that I know a ton of clinical placements in there where they're co-educating students. And in the service learning context, co-educating students is a really positive thing. But if you were to distinguish perhaps between, I guess it causes me to ask more questions. It'd be great to look at that based on, what type of, so Collaboratory also tracks high impact practices and distinguishes service learning from internship clinical type placements. And so we could break it down further to see if there is higher reciprocity when it's a service learning course versus a clinical placement course, to better understand and explain that, right? But again, that's about questioning our initial assumptions and the burden that we're placing. We typically don't want to burden our community partners, and we fear things like clinical placements and that sort of thing are an additional burden. I don't know though, right now in a time of crisis, our institution was trying to churn out nursing students who had yet not completed their 4-year graduating in May because there was a super high demand. And so when do those partnerships really, while we questioned them in the moment, I don't know that we should have been questioning in a moment of crisis when those played out to be a really beneficial partnership. So I'm just questioning all of my assumptions.
And I would just add from my point of view that I think while we have to put descriptors of thin and thick and low and high and medium, to be careful about the natural implication that something's good or bad. And I think Kristen Norris talked about the dimension of time. So one relationship that really shows, low or low medium reciprocity, that's a really new collaboration, actually might be exactly where you want or better than you ever thought. And I think being able to look at the dimension of time, but also, Kristen, as you were alluding to, the satisfaction on the part of all the folks. So it's almost like that other dimension, that low reciprocity or doing for may be a very appropriate and desired outcome on the part of all parties, but it may not be. And so I think it's always in the context. But for me, when I look at across my roles and looking at taking some responsibility for USDG's relationships with outside partners, or as we're interfacing across a number of dimensions, it's great to look at for those partners who desire that, are in a place to move forward. Then what does that deepening relationship look like? How do we get there? And then how do we support each other? So in our case, faculty development or students or resources, or telling the story in a way that really highlights your community partner, what's needed to move forward.
And I'll say from a professional development standpoint, JR, to your question, if we know the place that these partnerships are starting from, and we know that maybe some of the things that are happening are more of the gateway activities or gateway relationship things that happen early on in partnerships, how can we work with administrators and practitioners to really help faculty move to some of those deeper, more transformational relationships? We have to know where people are starting to know what resources they need to move them into things that might last longer, might move to become institutionalized, right? Like move away from this individual person and move towards something the university is supporting. So I think there's a lot of potential as we track this data over time to see where roles are changing or not changing, and what we can do in our roles on our campuses to help work with that.
I also want to like caution, one last thing, JR, sorry, I know we're over our time, and I appreciate the 40 people that have stuck around. I think that there's an interesting, so prior to my prior role, when we weren't tracking all things, public service, community engagement, low reciprocity, high reciprocity, and so I may be questioning the number of clinical placements that we have and that they're low reciprocity, but I might not question them when you also then looked at those partners that we're working with, and potentially there's community engaged research also happening. And maybe one of the negotiations and partnership work that's happened is that we're going to do this big research study, and they're going to be a clinical placement site for our students, and they're going to do this other thing. And so if I didn't include them, I'm missing out on an opportunity to understand the full portrait of our engagement with a specific partner or a type of community organizations within the community. And so I don't get so quick to question it in case there's a larger portrait to better understand. Every time there's a question, it gets answered, it goes away. I'm assuming somebody answered it.
Yeah, and I just somehow made the Q&A screen really big, and then I couldn't figure out how to go back to here. But here I am. No, thank you for those answers. I think that makes complete sense. We are at time. It looks like all of the questions have been answered in the Q&A chat. I just want to thank you all again for today's session. So Dr. Emily Janke from University of North Carolina, Greensboro, Dr. Terry Shelton from University of North Carolina, Greensboro, Dr. Kristen Norris from IUPUI, and Kristen Medlin from the Collaboratory. For those of you who are watching, we do have another webinar in 2 weeks.